distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and peace be upon you all. Before I begin my speech, I wish to first thank the Royal United Services Institute of Australia, South Australia, for giving me the honour of this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I confess to my ignorance that I was unfamiliar with the Institute prior to receiving your invitation. I was somewhat perplexed as to what possible contribution a humble cleric like myself could make to such a distinguished body of military and security thinkers as yourselves. Like most people, when I thought of the military, the image of uniformed warriors sprang to mind. I must thank a friend within my office for enlightening me with the important role that you play in the defense of our people, nation, and democratic institutions. May God protect you always. It can indeed be very challenging to examine the reality of the threat of Islamic extremism and the philosophy behind its existence, along with what motivates a mother to send her children to a church or synagogue to blow themselves up in a suicide attack. Muslims like myself, and non-Muslims alike, have sought to understand the reality behind this continuous hate and threat which is directed towards all of us. Today, I would like to examine the serious threat in the following stages. Firstly, the role of peaceful Muslim leaders in general. Secondly, Australian multiculturalism and where we are now today. Thirdly, the mindset of the moderate Muslim and how they view terrorism. Many people ask me, what is your opinion? What's your mindset? How is your mindset as a believer in God, a believer in the Prophet of Islam, and also a believer in the Quran? How is your mindset different from the mindset of the radical that wants to kill us all? In fact, why does the radical target you as well? And fourthly, the influence of and direct link between the early years of Islam and today's terrorism. And lastly, the foreign funding and infiltration of radicals in our education system and society, along with the special treatment of Muslims in Australia, while proposing realistic solutions to the above matters. As for the role of peaceful imams, mine is a world of contemplation, prayer and study. I had begun my road with the belief that this would be the totality of my life's work. The emergence of forces that try to pervert my religion has compelled me to take a more public role. There is an Arabic saying, silence is the sign of approval. As I do not approve under the current circumstances, I must speak out. Imam Ali once said, when the people of the truth remain silent, the people of falsehood believe themselves to be truthful. If only the extremists speak, only Islamic extremists speak, then understandably our people will suspect that all of my co-religionists pose a potential or active threat to this society. Nothing could be further from the truth. The vast majority of Australian Muslims wish only to live in peace and harmony. However, there does lurk a dark thread amongst us in recent times, and I have made it part of my work to address this in a twofold way. Firstly, to denounce and try to expose those who pose a real threat, and secondly, to demonstrate to the larger Australian community that there are Muslims who understand their peers and who uncompromisingly stand with them in all situations. To neglect the second objective is to risk ceding the growing debate to an extremist-influenced anti-Muslim backlash. The social and security consequences of this scenario, if it is allowed to develop, is frightening to contemplate. So, why does Imam Sheikh Muhammad Tawhidi appear to some as a controversial figure? And what is a Sheikh or Imam, and why a white turban? The title Sheikh in the Arabic language means senior. However, within the Islamic institutes and the educational seminaries, the word Sheikh is used as a terminology to define a cleric. The word Imam means the person who's standing in front. Therefore, if you had two people riding a horse, the one in front would be labeled the Imam. Anyone who stands in front in Arabic would be called the Imam. And when a sheikh, a cleric, is appointed by a higher Islamic authority to represent a Muslim community, then that sheikh is also known as an Imam. The white turban is a symbol that means that we have been crowned by the person wearing a black turban. And a black turban means the direct grandson of Prophet Muhammad. A white turban means they are not from the lineage of prophecy, but they have been crowned by someone from within the lineage of prophecy. And they are known as the Grand Ayatollahs, and they are the hierarchies. And I understand that because of me being somewhat of a rebel against the violence of Sharia law, I still choose to dress in the uniform that I graduated in, because it sends a much greater message. To many of those in the Islamic world, an Imam is a traditionalist with an almost medieval interpretation of Holy Scripture, inward-looking and non-receptive to the modern world. As you listen to me today, perhaps you will better understand why this perception of me exists. Many Muslims find a figure like myself extremely challenging. In the non-Islamic world of democracy, many find it difficult to believe that I am genuine in my desires for reform and modernization. Many have learned of the Islamic concept of legitimate deception, also referred to as taqiyya, and assume that I must be pursuing a particular Machiavellian agenda. Hence, it is easy to understand that I am seen by some as controversial. In a world of clashing political ideologies, certain doctrines have been entrenched as articles of faith. Among these is the doctrine of multiculturalism. In itself, multiculturalism is a practical, humane policy, and this is something I trust none of us here would disagree on. For any decent society to embrace, I have stated in recent times during my speeches and appearances on national media that Australia does not need to prove to anyone that it is a successful multicultural country. Our strong nation has indeed been built upon diversity. However, the question here is it healthy? Is it really healthy to pursue an approach of multiculturalism at all costs? This here is the question. Because we have seen in recent times that there have been terrorist attacks, and they've been committed by people who have abused our multicultural society and our tolerant majority. That we have allowed them to come, and their arrival into Australia has down the track costed us Australian blood. Therefore, is it a healthy idea that we have multiculturalism in this country at all costs? I wish to explain what I mean at this point. The tolerant Australian majority has been very accepting of successive waves of immigrants from a wide range of ethnic and religious backgrounds. And almost exclusively, within a single generation, the newcomers have integrated into the mainstream, while large numbers of Muslims have made this successful adjustment, a large minority have not. As decades have now passed since large-scale Muslim immigration to Australia began, one must ask, what is different about this particular community from all the previous waves of immigrants? I can speak with some authority on this matter. Why are the multiculturalism at all costs supporters silent on the risks to our society? Why? In light of the shocking events of recent times, their silence is perplexing to me. With hundreds of Australians known to be fighting with extremist groups such as ISIS in the Middle East, one must ask how they can pretend that there is not an elephant in the room in the form of a domestic base for radical Islamic extremism. I have heard a number of explanations for this phenomenon of silence during my meetings with members of government. And they range from local councils, mayors, and even many politicians. And I have travelled to Canberra and I have met with several people within the parliament, in government today. And the one that seems to have support, the argument that seems to have support, is that based on the notion that any criticism of Islamic communities is a threat to the whole doctrine of multiculturalism. This reasoning has led to otherwise sensible people putting forward quite strange arguments, very strange arguments. I will give a recent example of how this reasoning can lead to quite bizarre attempts to justify support for outdated concepts still alive within the Muslim community. A media organization actually aired a Sunni Muslim woman waxing eloquently on how, according to her faith, Islam was the most feminist religion. I can assure you that in the present structure of the majority of Islam's denominations, there is an argument that is extremely hard to sell. If there is a belief that intolerance for Islamic extremism is a threat to multiculturalism itself, one must wonder why there are no loud protests coming from the multitude of other communities. Well, it is obvious that if the protests are not there, it is because no other community has brought to this country a small hardcore who wish to destroy it. Indeed, it is an uncritical tolerance of attitudes and practices within the Muslim community, which might pose a longer-term threat to an otherwise successful multicultural policy. Integration is vital to maintaining a cohesive society. This cohesion is threatened by the concept of the hyphenated Australians. And I am proud to be an Australian Muslim and not a Muslim Australian. And this also applies in all of my work in my office and our association, that the law of the land needs to come before Sharia law, regardless. And the only reason why we have any sense of honor and respect, it is because the Islamic law that we follow needs to be a law that tells us, respect the land that you live upon. And it should tell us to respect the lives of those around us, and to not rubbish the host culture. The doctrine of multiculturalism in Australia is now over 40 years old and was based on the premise of respect and integration. In more recent times, it has become obvious that we have allowed cultures to enter this country which show no respect for the host culture, and far from assimilating, wish only to ghettoize and create a parallel, non-integrated community. In my view, blending in is hypocrisy. And we have seen many Islamic leaders in this country that dress in Western clothing. And when I say Islamic leaders, I mean that we graduate with the Islamic uniform, with the Islamic turban. But when a leader chooses to blend in by not wearing the Islamic dress code and wearing a suit and tie, looking posh and very modern and educated, and appears to have somewhat of an academic approach to everything, but as soon as they speak, extremism flows out. Radicalization is preached within their mosques. Therefore, blending in my view, is hypocrisy. We should dress in what we like as human beings, but integrate and adapt and respect the society around you, because the society around you couldn't care less what you dress in. Muslims should not blend in, they shouldn't integrate. This, of course, depends on their original intention when migrating to Australia, and whether they wanted to be part of Australia or just live as strangers amongst us. This doctrine now must be rethought from the base up, and it is not shameful for our government to look back at the last 20, 30 years and see how our immigration has developed, how immigration to this country and multiculturalism have developed, and what we can do to make it a better and stronger service that we give humans who truly want to be part of Australia. Not come to Australia hating everything, hating the society around them, but they love symphony. And as for the mindset of the misguided moderates, it is made up of two major factors. One, the Islamic traditions, two, the ethnic cultures. The Islamic traditions teach principle and discipline, while the ethnic culture teaches what is accepted within the society they were raised in. This does not necessarily mean that the Islamic traditions and ethnic cultures do not clash. In fact, they clash very often. I think this may be demonstrated in that there are over 20 Arabic nations in the same broad geographic area today. However, in the early years of Islam, these very countries were all united under one caliphate, meaning under one successor of Prophet Muhammad, forming a large Islamic empire. The main reason that this tradition did not continue was due to the traditionally clashing regional cultures within the caliphate. These differences may indeed be seen to this day. Some states, such as Saudi Arabia, beheading and hand chopping is taught by the violent version of Sharia law, whereas in Muslim Kuwait, this would be considered illegal, horrific behavior. In light of this history, it may be understandable as to why some moderates feel that they must not criticize other Muslims, irrespective of which Middle Eastern cultural tradition they may come from. This belief has hindered the moderate Muslims in their opposition to radical Muslims and limited their ability to reclaim their religion of love, peace, and tolerance from radicals. We see lack of condemnation of radicals by Islamic scholars and community leaders, which raises many questions as to why Muslims are not speaking against the corruption of each other, and the one who speaks is called the fake. I must say that the mentality of a Muslim living within the West and among those who their traditions have taught to be infidels makes it difficult to rise against his or her own brother in faith, fearing that it could strengthen the cause of the so-called infidel. The terrible trap which my people have fallen into as a result of this attitude has meant that the small minority of violent extremists can operate with minimal criticism, while knowing that there are misguided politicians fighting for their radical agenda to have a platform under the law of freedom of speech of a democratic society. This thinking by politicians is fatally flawed, because the radical doesn't believe in democracy to begin with. On the other side of the lake, the mindset of the radical Muslim focuses on what he or she believes is God's expectation from them. Radical Muslims believe their main land is Islamic land. Mecca, Medina, Iraq, Iran for Shia Muslims. And that their presence in the non-Islamic land of disbelief is merely a test from God and confers a greater responsibility upon their shoulders to spread their faith and ideology. And I remember when my father chose to migrate to Australia, he asked his teacher, who now is a prominent Grand Ayatollah, he said to him, am I allowed to travel to a non-Muslim country? And the teacher said, you're not allowed. But you can as an exception. But the moment Saddam Hussein collapses, you are to return back to Iraq in a Muslim country and raise your children in a Muslim country. And my father's hypocrite teacher has been living in London since the time Saddam was in power and until today. And he didn't go back. And this is exactly what we used to preach. This agenda justifies their long presence within the land of the infidels. Because if you ask Hizb ut-Tahrir, then why are you here? If you really hate us, then why are you here? They travel to Saudi Arabia, they travel to the Middle East, and believe you me, when they walk through the streets of the Muslim lands, they walk with their head up high. Why? Because they have an Australian passport. I swear to God. When they enter the Muslim airports, no one dares look them in the eye. Not because of their beards, but because of the Australian passport that has our Queen's signature on it. Without the passport, their value would be much low in the eyes of these Muslim authorities. But when they return, they forget the good that our citizenship and our passport has done for them. And the same with the Islam is the most feminist religion person who travels the world with an Australian passport and then says that they feel Australia is racist. This understanding is, of course, only a result of wrong teachings, which I myself used to preach in the past as well. Children that are born in non-Islamic lands are not blessed, or that they would grow to be deviants. And I promised myself that my first child would be born in Australia. A true follower of God would know that the land, all of it, belongs to God. And geographic borders do not make one nation worse or better than the other as human beings. The total rejection of Western democracy, total rejection, and people of the West is taught to Muslim radicals from a very young age. They are taught that we are not like them. And as a man of religion today, I do not support their position. One may wonder how the rise of radical Islam came to be, and how did it develop? The extremists and the radicals continue to promote the myth that the Westerners, for example, the CIA and the MI6, orchestrate terrorist attacks onto the West. Both common sense and my history as a man of religion make it plain to me the fallacy of this argument. I would like to say a few words about the real history of this. After the martyrdom of Prophet Muhammad in the year 632 AD, Islam witnessed many divisions that led to the formation of 73 denominations, with some Muslims glorifying the family of Prophet Muhammad more than the companions and vice versa. The battle of leadership after the Prophet Muhammad was indeed influenced by politics, which led to the transformation of prophetic succession to kingship. It is unfortunate that I have to admit to you as non-Muslims that the message of Islam was not hijacked decades ago, but centuries ago. All religions, all of them, emerge seeking peace and love, which is why the thousands embraced them. But during the early years of Islam, immediately after the death of Prophet Muhammad, this changed. Our first caliph, Abu Bakr, ruled from the year 632, followed by Umar and Uthman. All three spread Islam by the sword. All three spread Islam by the sword. And even though Islamic history refers to the geographic expansion of Islamic state as conquests, however, the definitions used in political science, those Islamic conquests constitute invasions and colonialism. to briefly shed some light on the history of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, two blood brother dynasties were rivals for power to rule. The Banu Hashim dynasty, the ancestors of Prophet Muhammad, and their stern, ruthless rivals, the Umayyad dynasty. With time, Medina became the home base for the Banu Hashim, and Damascus, Syria today, became the home base for the Umayyad dynasty. During the era of Yazid, the caliph of the so-called Umayyad dynasty, which began in the year 680, that governed the religion of Islam, the family and successors of Prophet Muhammad were given two options. Either you pledge allegiance to the kingdom or the caliph, or face death. Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, in rejection to this call, responded by saying his well-known quote, "Yazid, the murderer of innocent people, someone like me does not shake the hand of someone like him." He said, "Death with honor is far better than life in humility." And ultimately, this led to the beheading of Hussein, along with his family members, in a battle known as the Battle of Karbala in Iraq on the 10th of October 680, where he was forced to defend himself, along with only 72 of his family members and followers, and were finally brutally massacred by Yazid's army of 100,000 soldiers. Imam Hussein's ill son Ali and sister Zainab were taken hostage, along with the head of Imam Hussein raised above a spear from Iraq to Syria. Today, over 20 million Muslims, including Christians, from all corners of the world, continue the annual march of hundreds of kilometers from their countries to the city of Karbala to pay respect to his shrine during the annual pilgrimage of Arba'in, being the 40th day post-martyrdom. This has been recorded as the largest religious gathering on earth. It is with regards to Karbala phenomenon that Gandhi said, "I learned from Hussein how to be victorious when oppressed." Indeed, blood can be victorious against the sword. In Karbala, Imam Hussein lost the battle, but he won the war. This inspires me today to not shake the hand of any radical or any terrorist figure, no matter what. My dear friends, moderate Muslims, I humbly consider like myself, look at the occurrences that led to the killing of Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, and what he stood for. And we derive everlasting lessons that guide us. When the sword goes to war against morals and virtue, morals and good values always win in the long run. This is one very important aspect from the history of Islam. And we will never be able to move peacefully and positively forward unless we criticize our own history and denounce the actions and condemn the violence that existed throughout the development of this religion and stop its reoccurrence. If Muslims were taught the justification to behead the grandson of their own prophets, then it would also be justifiable for them in this age to behead the Christian and the Jew by default. This replica of Umayyad ideology is practiced on Muslims who are strict followers of the ways of the peaceful teachings in their own religion, since they are, again, targeted as non-Muslims. And yesterday, a Grand Mufti in Saudi Arabia by the name of Asim al-Hakim made a statement that Imam Tawhidi is an apostate. And he called onto a panel of imams, meaning jurists and muftis, to issue the sentencing of death on myself and for any Islamic government to undertake that sentencing. Which means I may no longer be able to travel to the Middle East, because the entire Gulf has an agreement with each other that should someone be wanted by a specific country, they would hand them over.
That's called extradition. That's what we call it.
It is now safe to say that the history of Islam had witnessed radicals infiltrating it from its earliest years, long before the establishment of USA and the United Kingdom, and all others that could be accused of creating Islamic terrorists. The rise of Wahhabism, founded by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, born in 1703, which is a replica of Umayyad ideology, has revived the ideological platform terrorists of the Islamic history once had, and has influenced the hundreds of thousands of radicals in joining terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It is true that the majority of terrorists are Sunni Muslims, but Shia Muslim groups such as Hezbollah and the Sepah of the Iranian regime also need to be treated as a threat, even though they came into existence to liberate South Lebanon, meaning Hezbollah. I would now like to move on to another social point that sheds light on the special treatment of Muslims in Australia. This being the link between outlaw motorcycle gangs and radical Islamists. The existing preconditions of their respective use means that such an alliance in some ways is in fact a natural one. Both groups share the same vision when viewing the legal authorities. They are seen as tyrants that need to be brought down. Both outlaw gang members and radical Islamists believe that their version of justice and governance should be established upon the land. The initial contact between these groups were, it seems, forged in prisons. I shall be touching on this matter in more depth shortly. Both radical Islamists and motorcycle gang members largely come from a common economic and socially depressed environment. In both cases, radical Muslims and motorcycle gangs use numbers to inflict terror upon their opponents. They use their numbers also to send an intimidating message to any would-be opponents and the media. Each group has their own recognizable uniform. For the gangs, it is their colors, and for the radical Muslim, traditional Middle Eastern clothing and beards, very long beards. The motorcycle gangs provide the radicals with an ally from the mainstream Australian community, and the radical Islamists are a source for potential money, lots of money, and weapons from the radicals' home countries. As only a small percentage of containers entering our ports are able to be carefully searched, it is difficult to cut off the supply of brand new weapons. Weapons which have been fired might well be detected by trained sniffer dogs, whereas new weapons are simply pieces of metal. And on the subject of money, as we see from time to time, large sums of cash are detected in the process of being sent to foreign destinations. The gangs and radicals present a potentially unholy two-way trade. Some countries under sanctions would then be in receipt of Western currency, and in return, if there is one thing not in short supply within these countries, it is weapons. One assumes that by imprisoning the radical Islamists, that they would be safely isolated from the mainstream community. While imprisoning them is certainly a necessary legal sanction, there is a terrible flaw to this idea. In fact, one of the byproducts of imprisoning them within the regular jails opens a new set of problems. The non-radicals are being exposed to radicalization by this particular subset of prisoners. There are prisoners that enter the prison system as thieves, thugs, and fraudsters, and emerge as Islamic radicals looking for an opportunity to vent their frustrations upon society at large, while believing that they are doing God's work and shall be rewarded for it in paradise, 72 virgins, which don't exist. These radical groups provide a sense of belonging and meaning to persons living marginalized lives. In this regard, an important question worth asking is, who are the Islamic clerics visiting our prisons. Who are they? Do we know them? Is there a list of Islamic clerics that visit prisons? One would hope that the majority of these clerics and moderates are moderate and integrated individuals. However, how can we be certain that there are not a number of radical clerics using their privileged access to the prisoners to promote their extremist views? And on Friday last week, a report showed that violent and dangerous inmates were trying to force other prisoners in some of Australia's worst prisons to convert to Islam against their own will. Another major issue is the books that are being introduced to our prisons. Our most sacred books in Islam, and you can go check, and my lectures provide scans, and I bring the books and I show them to the people. There's nothing to hide. Our books, most sacred books, do teach terrorism. They do. And they exist, not on Jupiter, here. They exist, and they do teach terrorism. This is not the Quran, so they can be banned. Now, we don't want to go back in time and say, let's ban books, because that's not right. They're available online. But we can ban them, these formulas of terrorism, from our universities, so that our students that are writing these assignments and theses do not end up using these books as sources. We don't want to be publishing what is already a formula of terrorism. These books do exist. And these books are being sent into our prisons. And the way it's happening, and I've spoken to many authorities in the one private meeting that I had with the intelligence services in Adelaide, and I said to them that radicals are sending books into prisons, and they're doing it in a very clever way. Misleading covers. The book might say, how to live a peaceful life, how to forget your worries and troubles. But inside, it's the very terrorist formula. And that's why on Friday, that's what the media reported. That now Australian Christians are being forced into Islam. Otherwise, they would be killed within the prison. This is happening in Sydney. Now, when I speak, I'm not here hoping to incite violence. That's not my intention. Or to scare you. But it is not harmful to educate ourselves in a harmful ideology that exists within our society. And by the way, this is the very book that says Prophet Muhammad had the strength of 30 men and would visit 9 of his wives every night. One cannot help but wonder what on earth the man's diet was. Because I, as a man of Arabic origin, I can assure you that no Arab has such ability. Not now, not ever. These radical groups have to be treated as the special category of criminals that they are. The solution must include association laws to prevent them from gathering in groups, and they must be completely separated from all other categories of prisoners when they are inside the correctional system. Only imams with a proven social record of moderation and indeed patriotism should be allowed to engage with them as spiritual advisors. Radical Muslims are now looking at yet another highly marginalized and vulnerable part of our community, the indigenous people. The increasing number of indigenous people identifying on the census as Muslim is a clear indication that there are inroads being made into this community. As Australians, we believe in freedom of religion. However, we as Muslim imams need to make sure that if Islam grows, it grows in the right direction. At the moment, I do not know whether those preaching are radicals or moderates, but this is a matter which I believe needs closer examination. In recent times, indigenous celebrity Anthony Mundine appeared on social media supporting the Sharia law concept of beating your wife. And a most troubling development considering the unfortunate levels of domestic violence within the indigenous community already. The external funding of mosques, imams, and schools is indeed also a security concern. A study titled National Security, Secret Saudi Funding of Australian Institutions revealed that many Australian universities, now driven entirely by financial priorities, have uncritically welcomed Saudi sources of funding, even though this creates a major national security problem. Massive funding is presently being provided by Saudi Arabia to promote Wahhabism, the fundamentalist, exclusivist, punitive, and sectarian form of Islam that is both the Saudi state religion and the chief theological component for Sunni versions of Islamism. The totalitarian ideology, including jihadism and also guiding jihadism, and most of the active terrorist groups in the world. Globally, this money is flowing to terrorist groups, political parties, and religious and community groups, as well as to universities and schools. In Australia, there is a concern that such funding could damage and even corrupt the Australian university system, especially given the existing ideological bias, political naivety, opportunism, managerialism, and the pseudo-entrepreneurial attitudes of many university academics and administrators. The question of how foreign powers and agents are able to influence, direct, or even control tertiary education in Australia and other Western countries is vitally important. This is because of the rise of Islamism and jihadism. When an ideology is so powerful, ministers subscribe to that ideology. It becomes the norm to preach. Because if the Minister of Education in Saudi Arabia has relations with our educational systems, and he's a radical Wahhabi, and they're going to be sending students to study here, they're not going to be sending the moderate ones. They will not send the moderate ones. In fact, the moderate ones who criticize radical Islam in Australia usually are hunted down by the Saudi embassy and their visas are cancelled and they're sent back to Saudi Arabia. And with many Islamic government agendas working in Australia, whether it be Saudi Arabia, Sunni, or Iran, Shia government, a particular desire of mine is to encourage young Muslims to enter the military. In the same way I have worked with the police in the past to recruit young Muslims into the law enforcement agencies. It is my belief that this would be beneficial in a number of ways. For the Muslim recruits, it will be a path to an honorable career of service to their country. In addition, it will expose them to a broader community. I am told that barracks life is a great leveler, where very different people are molded into a sense of comradeship and shared purpose. For the recruits from the wider community, the presence in their ranks of Muslims will enable them to see that most of my co-religionists are reasonable and moderate human beings who are prepared to risk hardship and perhaps even their lives in support for this wonderful country. I believe that this will be an important step in the process of integration and help reduce the current tensions in our society. This will also provide the military with a core of personnel who will have language and cultural knowledge of great value. I will ask you to reflect on what you see as the respective points for and against such a recruitment policy. From a broader national perspective, the sight of Muslim service personnel can only show that there are indeed many patriotic Australian Muslims. Such a sight could help reduce the suspicions and fears held by some in the wider Australian community, and also show to the Islamic community that all patriots are welcome to bear arms in defense of our country, Australia. I read recently that ISIS has aims to obtain radiological weapons, the so-called dirty bomb. I am certainly no military expert, but I can see the attraction such a weapon would have for those with the mindset of ISIS. And I truly fear that a renegade regime like North Korea could provide the materials for such a weapon. ISIS dreams that the Muslims in the West can be drawn, great numbers, into active support for them. A radiological attack on a major population center could well provoke a massive wave of support for anti-Muslim extremists and drive otherwise moderate Muslims into the arms of radical Islamists. Hence, I believe that this is a threat we must guard against as a priority. The struggle, I said this to an elderly gentleman and he began to cry. The struggle against these terrorists will be a long one. However, I believe that it will be wise to remember the saying, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It is worth mentioning in this regard that I myself had proudly applied to join the reserve forces of our country, Australia, as a chaplain in first preference and an army soldier as second preference. However, I was forced to withdraw my application due to restrictions with regards to my public speaking as an imam. And I felt that I could serve Australia greatly by not remaining silent. We are a strong nation with a strong elected government and intelligence system. We are not dealing with a well-organized terrorist movement within Australia. Rather, there are a number of determined amateurs. This is a challenge we Australians will win. I cannot presume to know the beliefs that guide your daily lives. For me, there is the sure and certain knowledge that there is a judgment day where I will be asked to explain my actions and inactions in life. When will I be able to say to God, who knows all people's hearts, when I am asked, Imam Tawhidi, what did you do? My cause is clear to me, and my personal fate is in the hands of God, who knows the time of all people's death. I leave you all with the statement of Imam Ali, people are either your brothers in faith or your equal in humanity and creation. I thank you all for your kindness and attention. May God bless you all, and God bless Australia.